A retired soldier gives his jacket to a freezing homeless man, but what happens just days later leaves everyone in tears. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Frank Miller woke with a tremor in his chest and the familiar sensation that something was wrong. Through his bedroom's frosted window, he watched an unexpected blizzard blanketing Boston in a white shroud. At 68, his joints could predict weather better than meteorologists, and today they screamed danger. He sat up slowly, wincing as pain shot through his lower back. The digital clock read 5:17 a.m., too early for most, but normal for a man who hadn't slept past 6 since Vietnam. Frank rubbed his weathered face, feeling the rough terrain of scars time had left. Outside, the wind howled like it had something to prove. Just a storm, he muttered to himself, though the unease lingered. His bedroom was Spartan, a dresser, a nightstand with medications he pretended to take regularly, and a small framed photo of him and Dorothy on their 30th anniversary. The walls remained the same pale blue they'd been for decades, just like his morning routine. Frank's feet found his slippers as he stood, stretching carefully to avoid aggravating his arthritis. He shuffled to the closet and pulled out his prized military jacket from Vietnam. The olive green fabric was worn at the elbows, and the name Miller remained proudly embroidered across the chest. Frank ran his fingers over the letters, a ritual that connected him to a past he rarely discussed. The jacket slid onto his shoulders like an old friend, still fitting despite the years that had rounded his once trim frame. He zipped it halfway, adjusting the collar in the mirror. For a moment, a much younger man stared back at him, a shadow memory quickly gone. Frank turned to look at Dorothy, still asleep in their bed. 40 years of marriage had softened neither her determination nor her ability to see through his facades. Her breathing was deep and steady, silver hair splayed across the pillow. He decided against waking her. She'd only worry about his morning walk in such weather, and Frank had never been good at explaining his need to face the elements alone. "Back soon," he whispered, though she couldn't hear. The house was silent as he descended the stairs, avoiding the third step that always creaked. In the kitchen, he skipped coffee, opting instead for 2 ibuprofen swallowed dry. The forecast on the refrigerator magnet board predicted light flurries, not the blinding white chaos outside. Meteorologists, always wrong when it mattered. Frank wrapped a scarf around his neck, pulled on his gloves, and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath. The snow was already ankle-deep and falling fast, transforming familiar streets into an Arctic landscape. His breath clouded before him as he pulled the jacket tighter and began his route toward Central Park. The neighborhood was deserted, streetlights creating halos in the swirling snow. Frank walked with the measured pace of a man who had nowhere specific to be, but was determined to get there on time. The wind sliced through him like shrapnel, bringing back memories he'd rather forget. Jungles and rain and the smell of gunpowder. By the time he reached the park entrance, his cheeks were numb and his nose running. Rational thought suggested turning back, but Frank Miller had never been accused of being overly rational. The park's paths disappeared under pristine white, his footprints the only evidence of human presence. That's when he saw him, a solitary figure huddled on a bench, violently shivering. An old man with a white beard and tattered dark clothes, a faded blue beanie barely covering his gray hair. The man stared vacantly ahead, his expression disturbingly familiar, the same 1,000-yard stare Frank had seen in too many foxholes. Frank approached cautiously, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. The man didn't look up, seemingly entranced by the falling flakes or perhaps seeing something else entirely. "You'll freeze out here, friend," Frank said, his voice rough from the cold. The man blinked slowly as if returning from somewhere distant. "I'm fine," he mumbled, but his blue-tinged lips contradicted his words. Frank studied him more carefully, trembling hands, reddened eyes, uncontrolled shivering. Early hypothermia, no question. The man's coat was thin, more appropriate for autumn than a Boston blizzard, and his boots were split at the seams. "No, you're not," Frank said matter-of-factly. "Where's your shelter?" The man shrugged. "Full up. Too many folks when it gets cold." Frank nodded, understanding the mathematics of urban homelessness. Too many people, too few beds, especially during weather emergencies. Without hesitation, Frank unzipped his military jacket. The cold immediately bit through his flannel shirt, but he ignored it. He slipped the jacket off and held it out. "Take it. You need it more than I do." The man looked up, surprise breaking through his vacant expression. His eyes fell on the embroidered name. "I can't take that. Looks important." "It is," Frank admitted, "but I've survived worse." The man didn't move, either from pride or frozen muscles. Frank stepped closer, still holding out the jacket. "Look, I'm going home to a warm house. You don't have that option right now." A young woman in a nurse's uniform hurried past, then stopped, observing the scene with concern. She'd taken a shortcut through the park, despite the weather, her hospital ID card flapping against her coat. "Sir, you need protection in this cold," she called to Frank, noting his thin shirt already collecting snowflakes. "I'm fine, miss. Just make sure this man gets to a shelter if you can," Frank replied, not taking his eyes off the homeless man. The nurse hesitated, then nodded, pulling out her phone. "I'll call someone." The homeless man finally reached for the jacket with stiff fingers. As Frank helped him into it, he noticed the man's tears freezing on his weathered cheeks. "Walter," the man said suddenly, his voice stronger. "My name's Walter." Frank nodded and extended his hand. "Frank Miller, Vietnam, 1971. Something flickered in Walter's eyes, a spark of recognition, or perhaps just gratitude. He gripped Frank's hand with surprising strength, like a drowning man clutching a lifeline. The nurse approached again. "I've called a shelter van. They'll be here in 10 minutes. She looked at Frank with concern. "You should get inside too, sir." Frank nodded, already feeling the cold seeping into his bones. "Take care, Walter. That jacket's seen me through some rough spots. It'll do the same for you." Walter looked down at the name embroidered on his chest, running his fingers over the letters as Frank had done hours earlier. "Thank you," he whispered, though whether to Frank or some invisible presence wasn't clear. Frank turned and headed home, the wind now at his back, but somehow colder without his jacket. His shirt was quickly soaked with snow, and by the time he reached his front steps, his teeth were chattering uncontrollably. He slipped inside quietly, eager to warm up before Dorothy woke. The house was still dark, the thermostat reading a comfortable 72 degrees that felt like a tropical heat wave after the park. Frank stripped off his wet clothes in the laundry room, wrapping himself in the robe that hung beside the dryer. In the kitchen, he brewed coffee stronger than usual, hoping to chase away the chill that had settled deep in his chest. "Frank?" Dorothy's voice came from the stairway. "Is that you?" "Just me," he called back, his voice raspier than normal. She appeared in the doorway, her reading glasses perched on her nose, concern evident in her expression. "You went out in this? Are you crazy?" "Just a quick walk," he said, avoiding her, gaze by concentrating on his coffee. Dorothy moved closer, her eyes narrowing. "Where's your jacket? The military one?" Frank had hoped to avoid this question until he'd formulated a better explanation. "Must have left it somewhere," he muttered vaguely. "Left it somewhere, that jacket you treat like a sacred relic?" Her voice rose with disbelief. "Frank Miller, what happened?" "Nothing happened. I'll find it later." He turned away, coughing slightly. Dorothy wasn't fooled, but she'd learned over 40 years when pushing would yield nothing. "Well, take a hot shower before you catch pneumonia. I'll make breakfast. That night, as the blizzard intensified, Frank was struck by a violent coughing fit that left him gasping for air. His body shook with fever, sweat soaking through his pajamas despite the chill he couldn't shake. "We need to go to the hospital," Dorothy insisted, her hand cool against his burning forehead. "Don't be ridiculous," Frank growled between coughs. "I've faced worse in the war." Dorothy rolled her eyes. "Yes, 50 years ago when you weren't eligible for senior discounts." Frank waved her off, swallowing another cough that tasted faintly of iron. "Just need rest." The next morning, the local news program showed a story about an anonymous veteran's act of kindness, giving his jacket to a homeless man during the worst blizzard in a decade. The nurse had taken a photo and shared it on social media, where it had gone viral overnight. Frank quickly switched off the television before Dorothy could see. What Frank didn't realize was that Walter, now sheltered and wearing the military jacket, was staring intently at the embroidered name, his wrinkled hands trembling as he pulled out a yellowed photograph of two young soldiers standing side by side in Vietnam. At the shelter, Walter sat alone in the corner of the common room, his weathered hands carefully examining the photograph he'd kept through years of homelessness. The image showed two young soldiers, barely men, standing shoulder to shoulder in the humid Vietnamese jungle. Both wore weary smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Walter's trembling finger traced the face of the soldier on the left, then moved to the name embroidered on the jacket he now wore, Miller. Could it really be the same man? He whispered to himself, the coincidence seeming too incredible to believe. The shelter volunteer approached with a steaming cup of coffee. "You doing okay there, Walter? That's quite a nice jacket you've got." Walter quickly tucked the photo away. "A gift," he said simply, pulling the military jacket tighter around his thin frame. Its warmth was more than physical. It carried a weight of memory and connection he hadn't felt in decades. Meanwhile, Frank Miller sat in his living room, remote in hand, watching the morning news. The reporter's voice filled the quiet space. In heartwarming news, an anonymous veteran gave his military jacket to a homeless man during yesterday's unexpected blizzard. A passing nurse captured this moment of kindness that has since gone viral on social media. The screen showed a slightly blurry image of Frank placing his jacket around Walter's shoulders. Frank quickly hit the power button, plunging the screen to black just as Dorothy entered the room carrying 2 mugs of tea. "What were you watching?" she asked, setting his mug on the side table. "Nothing interesting," Frank replied, his voice raspier than usual. He stifled another cough, feeling the tightness in his chest that had worsened overnight. Dorothy gave him a concerned look but didn't press further. "You should take it easy today. That cough sounds worse." Frank nodded non-committally, taking a sip of tea to soothe his raw throat. "Just need to shake this off." The next 3 days passed in a blur of worsening symptoms. Frank's fever spiked each night, and his coughing fits became more violent. Dorothy's worry deepened as she watched her husband's stubborn refusal to seek medical attention. On the 3rd morning after the blizzard, Frank shuffled into the kitchen, moving slower than usual. The simple act of making coffee seemed to require enormous effort. As he reached for a mug from the cabinet, a stabbing pain shot through his chest. The coffee cup slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor as Frank collapsed beside it. "Frank!" Dorothy screamed, rushing to his side. His face had turned an alarming shade of gray, his breathing shallow and labored. With shaking hands, she grabbed the phone and dialed 911. "My husband has collapsed," she told the dispatcher, her voice tight with fear. "He's 68 with a history of—" She paused, realizing how little she actually knew about Frank's medical history from Vietnam. "Please hurry." The ambulance arrived within minutes, paramedics quickly assessing Frank's condition as critical. Dorothy rode beside him, clutching his limp hand as the siren wailed through Boston streets. At Massachusetts General Hospital, a young doctor with tired eyes examined Frank before ordering a battery of tests. 2 hours later, he returned to where Dorothy anxiously waited in the consultation room. "Mrs. Miller, your husband has severe pneumonia," the doctor explained, his expression grave. "His chest X-rays show significant infection in both lungs, probably exacerbated by recent exposure to extreme cold without adequate protection." Dorothy frowned, confusion cutting through her worry. "What do you mean? Frank wouldn't go out without proper clothing." The doctor looked perplexed. "Well, the local news showed—" He stopped abruptly as a nurse burst into the room. "Dr. Harrison, his oxygen levels are dropping rapidly." The nurse's urgent tone sent a chill through Dorothy. "Start him on high-flow oxygen and prep for possible intubation," Dr. Harrison ordered, all traces of his earlier exhaustion vanishing as he followed the nurse at a run. Dorothy stood frozen for a moment before hurrying after them. By the time she reached Frank's room, it was filled with medical personnel working with controlled urgency. She caught glimpses of her husband between their shifting bodies, his face obscured by an oxygen mask, his chest rising and falling in irregular, shallow breaths. A kind-faced nurse gently guided Dorothy back to the waiting area. "The doctors need space to work. I'll update you as soon as we know more." The minutes stretched into hours as Dorothy sat alone, her mind replaying the doctor's puzzling comment about exposure to cold without protection. Frank had been coughing since the morning after the blizzard, but he'd insisted it was nothing serious. Had something happened during his walk that he hadn't told her about? In the hospital lobby, Walter entered hesitantly, still wearing Frank's military jacket. The warmth inside the building felt foreign after so many winters spent mostly outdoors. In his hands, he clutched a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. He approached the reception desk, suddenly conscious of his appearance, the untrimmed beard, the clothes that hung loosely on his thin frame despite recent meals at the shelter. "Excuse me," Walter said to the receptionist, who barely glanced up from her computer. "I'm looking for a patient named Frank Miller. He was admitted today, I believe." The receptionist gave him a dismissive look. "Are you family?" "No, but I have something important that belongs to him," Walter explained, his voice gaining strength. "Please, I need to see Frank Miller. I have something that belonged to his father." The receptionist was about to refuse when a passing nurse paused, studying Walter with curious recognition. "Wait, are you the man from the jacket story?" she asked. "The one that's been all over social media?" Walter shifted uncomfortably. "I suppose I am." The nurse turned to the receptionist. "This is the homeless man who received the veteran's jacket during the blizzard. It's been all over the news." She looked back at Walter. "That jacket belongs to one of our patients, doesn't it?" Walter nodded. "Frank Miller. I need to speak with him or his family." The nurse's expression softened. "Let me get my supervisor. Wait here." Meanwhile, in the ICU waiting area, Dorothy had discovered the truth. A text from her neighbor included a link to the viral story with the caption, "Isn't this Frank?" Dorothy stared at her phone screen, the image of her husband giving away his beloved jacket to a homeless man in the middle of a blizzard, filling her with a mixture of pride and exasperation. "You foolish, stubborn man," she whispered, tears trailing down her cheeks as she looked toward the closed doors of the intensive care unit where Frank lay fighting for his life. Dr. Harrison emerged from those doors, his face set in a grim expression that made Dorothy's heart sink. "Mrs. Miller, we've stabilized your husband for now," he began, sitting beside her. "But we've found something concerning in his scans. There are old scarring patterns in his lungs consistent with exposure to Agent Orange in Vietnam. This is complicating our treatment approach." Dorothy felt the floor drop away beneath her. In 40 years of marriage, Frank had never mentioned exposure to the toxic defoliant. How much else had he kept hidden from her? "Is he going to be all right?" she managed to ask, her voice barely audible. Dr. Harrison's hesitation spoke volumes. "We're doing everything we can. The next 48 hours will be critical. In the lobby, Walter had finally been permitted to proceed after explaining his story to the nursing supervisor. He sat nervously in a small consultation room, the wooden box balanced carefully on his knees, waiting for someone to take him to Frank or his family. Dorothy, needing a moment to collect herself, decided to find the cafeteria for coffee. As she turned the corner toward the elevators, she nearly collided with a man sitting in the small waiting area, a thin, bearded man wearing her husband's military jacket. "You," she said, stopping abruptly, a complex emotion washing over her as she recognized both the jacket and the man from the viral photo. Walter stood quickly, the wooden box clutched tightly in his hands. "Mrs. Miller?" he asked uncertainly. Dorothy nodded, her eyes fixed on the familiar olive-green fabric with Frank's name embroidered across the chest. "I'm Walter," he said, his voice low and respectful. "I'm so sorry about the jacket. I came to return it." He began to remove it, but Dorothy shook her head. "No, keep it on. It's cold outside." She sighed heavily. "It's not your fault. Frank has always been like this, stubborn as a mule. He would have found some way to catch pneumonia even without giving away his coat." Walter looked down at his worn boots. "How is he?" "Not good," Dorothy admitted, her composure finally breaking as tears welled up again. "The doctor says there are complications from his time in Vietnam." Walter nodded solemnly, understanding in his eyes. The war leaves marks that never really heal. A moment of silence stretched between them, two strangers connected by a single act of kindness and a military jacket that had witnessed history. Walter hesitated, then carefully opened the wooden box he carried. Inside lay a military medal and a faded photograph, the same one he had examined earlier at the shelter. "Mrs. Miller, do you know who this man is standing next to your husband?" he asked, showing her the photograph. Dorothy took it, squinting through her reading glasses at the two young soldiers. "Frank never talks about the war. Not ever." "This is my father, Sergeant James Howard," Walter explained, his voice thick with emotion. "From what I understand, your husband carried him out of a minefield after he was wounded." Dorothy stared at Walter with dawning comprehension, the pieces falling into place. "This can't be coincidence. You finding each other after all these years." "I didn't know who Frank was when he gave me the jacket," Walter admitted. "Not until I saw the name. My father always spoke of a soldier named Miller who saved his life. I never imagined I would meet him by chance in a park during a blizzard." Dorothy was about to respond when a sharp alarm sounded from the direction of the ICU. The sudden noise sent a jolt of fear through her as medical staff rushed past them toward Frank's room. "Code Blue, ICU Room 4, Code Blue," announced the overhead speaker in a calm voice that belied the emergency. Dorothy and Walter watched helplessly as doctors and nurses ran into Frank's room, the sound of the alarm growing louder as the door opened, then muffled as it swung shut behind them. "We're losing him," the doctor announced, as the medical team worked frantically to stabilize Frank, whose vital signs were plummeting dangerously. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor had transformed into an erratic pattern that sent waves of panic through the crowded room. Dorothy stood in the corridor outside the ICU, her face drained of color as she clutched Walter's hand. Through the small window in the door, she caught glimpses of the desperate efforts to save her husband. Doctors shouting orders, nurses moving with practiced efficiency, and at the center of it all, Frank's still form on the bed. "It's the third cardiac arrest in 24 hours, a nurse whispered to a colleague as she hurried past Dorothy with an armful of supplies. Walter tightened his grip on Dorothy's hand, the military jacket, Frank's jacket, seeming to weigh heavier on his shoulders with each passing moment. The small wooden box containing his father's memorabilia pressed against his side, tucked securely in the jacket's inner pocket. "I need to speak with him," Walter insisted, his voice low but determined. "I need to tell him." Dorothy turned to him, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. She had cried all the tears she could spare. Now she needed strength. Tell him what, Walter? Walter looked down at their joined hands, his weathered and rough from years on the streets, hers marked with age but well cared for. That he didn't fail, that my father lived a good life because of him, that the debt he thinks he owes was paid decades ago. A tense hour passed before Dr. Harrison emerged from Frank's room, pulling his surgical mask down with a weary motion. Dorothy and Walter immediately stood, bracing for the worst. He's stabilized, the doctor said, his exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders. But I won't sugarcoat this, Mrs. Miller. Your husband is in critical condition. The infection has severely compromised his lungs, and the old scarring from Agent Orange exposure is complicating things. But he's alive, Dorothy stated, needing confirmation more than explanation. Yes, he's alive. We've placed him on a ventilator to support his breathing. Dr. Harrison ran a hand through his disheveled hair. The next few days will be decisive. I wish I could offer more certainty. What can we do? Walter asked, surprising both Dorothy and the doctor with his directness. Dr. Harrison considered the question. Talk to him. There's evidence that patients in critical conditions can sometimes hear what's happening around them, even when they appear unresponsive. Familiar voices, meaningful conversations, they might help anchor him. Dorothy nodded, determination replacing the helplessness in her expression. Then that's what we'll do. After some discussion, Dorothy convinced the medical staff to allow Walter into Frank's room, despite the usual family-only policy in the ICU. He's connected to Frank in a way I'm not, she explained to the head nurse. He knows things about my husband that I never did. The nurse relented, recognizing the unusual circumstances. 15 minutes, no more, and one visitor at a time. Walter entered Frank's room cautiously, the steady hum and beep of medical equipment creating an otherworldly atmosphere. Frank lay motionless, tubes and wires connecting him to various machines. The ventilator made a rhythmic, whooshing sound as it forced air into his lungs. Pulling a chair close to the bed, Walter sat down, suddenly uncertain. What do you say to a man you've only met once, but who changed your father's life, and by extension yours? Mr. Miller, he began softly, then corrected himself. Frank, I don't know if you can hear me, but I hope some part of you can. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. My name is Walter Howard. James Howard was my father. The monitors continued their steady rhythm, giving no indication that Frank heard anything. But Walter continued, his voice gaining confidence as he spoke. My father used to tell me stories about Vietnam. Stories I'm guessing you never told your wife. Walter glanced toward the door where Dorothy waited outside. He said you were the bravest man he ever knew, not because you weren't scared. He said everyone with sense was scared over there, but because you never let fear stop you from doing what needed to be done. Walter pulled out the faded photograph from the wooden box, even though Frank's eyes remained closed. He kept this picture until the day he died, said it reminded him that even in the worst places, you can find the best people. As the minutes passed, Walter shared stories his father had told him. Stories of jungle patrols, of monsoon rains that seemed endless, of the strange brotherhood formed among men who had nothing in common except the uniform they wore and the fear they carried. Dad said you sang Bridge Over Troubled Water while carrying him through that minefield, Walter continued, a small smile breaking through his serious expression. Said your singing was so bad it kept him conscious because he was afraid you'd step on a mine if he passed out and couldn't correct your tone-deaf ass. His words, not mine. From outside the room, Dorothy watched through the window, fascinated and moved by the one-sided conversation. In 40 years of marriage, Frank had shared almost nothing about his time in Vietnam. The war had been a locked room in their house of memories, a room Frank never opened, and Dorothy had eventually stopped knocking on. When Walter's 15 minutes were up, Dorothy took his place at Frank's bedside. He told me things I never knew, she said to her unconscious husband, stroking his hand where IV lines snaked across his skin. All these years, Frank. All these years you carried these memories alone. Over the next 2 days, Dorothy and Walter established a routine, taking turns sitting with Frank, talking to him, reading newspaper articles, or simply providing quiet company. Walter continued sharing stories he'd heard from his father, filling in the blanks of Frank's military service that Dorothy had never been able to access. On the 3rd day, Frank's condition deteriorated dramatically. His temperature spiked and his oxygen levels dropped, despite the ventilator's assistance. Dr. Harrison performed another examination, his expression growing increasingly concerned. "His lungs are failing," he told Dorothy privately, outside Frank's room where Walter couldn't hear. "We've increased his antibiotics and support measures, but—" He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with what he needed to say next. "You should prepare for the possibility that he may not recover. It might be time to consider what Frank would want regarding extraordinary measures." Dorothy felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath her feet. "Are you asking if I want to let my husband die?" "I'm asking what Frank would want," Dr. Harrison clarified gently. "These are difficult conversations, but important ones." When Dorothy relayed this conversation to Walter in the hospital cafeteria, his reaction surprised her. Instead of the defeat she expected, his face hardened with resolve. "It's not going to end like this," Walter declared firmly, his voice stronger than she'd heard it before. "Not after everything he survived. Not when he's only in this condition because he gave me his damn jacket." That night, while Dorothy dozed in a chair near the window, Walter sat close to Frank's bed. The ICU was quieter during the night shift, the lighting dimmed to simulate a normal day-night cycle for patients who couldn't distinguish between them. Walter leaned in close to Frank's ear and began to sing softly. Not "Bridge Over Troubled Water," but a military cadence his father had taught him, one that only the men in Frank's platoon had known. It was an improvised melody created in the trenches that had become their secret code, a way to identify each other in the darkness of the jungle. Left, right, left, right, left Charlie's waitin' in the night, Bravo Company stands tall and proud, Miller's boys will make it out all right. Walter's voice was low and rough, but the cadence was unmistakable. As he sang, he noticed a subtle change in the heart monitor's rhythm. Not dramatic, but different. Frank's fingers twitched slightly, the first voluntary movement in days. Encouraged, Walter continued talking, his voice growing more urgent. "My father never got to thank you properly, Frank. He wanted you to have this." He placed his father's military medal in Frank's limp hand, closing the unresponsive fingers around it. "He received this for bravery under fire, but he always said it should have been yours." The monitors showed more changes, small fluctuations in heart rate and blood pressure that suggested something was happening beneath the surface of Frank's unconsciousness. Walter kept talking, recounting how his father had built a good life after Vietnam, how he'd raised a family and always kept that photograph nearby, how he'd told his children to live honorably because that's what Frank Miller would do. Suddenly, Frank's eyes opened for the first time in days. They were unfocused at first, then gradually sharpened as they fixed on Walter's face. His hand tightened weakly around the metal, and his cracked lips moved, forming a single word around the ventilator tube. "Howard. I'm his son," Walter replied, tears flowing freely down his weathered cheeks. "James was my father." Dorothy awakened to the sound of monitors beeping at a different rhythm and the rush of medical staff into the room. Her first thought was terror, that this was the end, that Frank was leaving her. Instead, she found her husband conscious, his eyes fixed on Walter with recognition and emotion that transcended his weakened state. Dr. Harrison checked Frank's vital signs and reviewed the monitoring data with undisguised amazement. "The readings are showing improvement across multiple systems," he announced, perplexed. "I can't explain it. In 40 years of medicine, I've never seen anything quite like this." Frank remained critically ill, but for the first time since his admission, there was genuine hope for recovery. The medical team adjusted his treatment plan, encouraged by his unexpected response. When Walter tried to leave the hospital later that night, exhaustion finally catching up with him, he collapsed in the corridor outside Frank's room. The nurses who rushed to help him were alarmed by his pallor and rapid, shallow breathing. The emergency physician who examined Walter delivered sobering news. Walter had been ignoring symptoms of advanced cancer for months, choosing to live on the streets rather than seek treatment. The stress of the past few days had pushed his already compromised body beyond its limits. As Walter was admitted to a room 2 floors below Frank's ICU, the parallel became clear. 2 stubborn men, both keeping their suffering private, both now fighting for their lives in the same hospital because of a chance encounter in a snowy park and a military jacket that connected their fates across generations. Frank's eyes flickered open, blinking against the harsh hospital lighting. The ventilator tube had been removed the previous day, replaced by a less invasive oxygen cannula that allowed him to speak, albeit in a raspy whisper. His gaze searched the room, finding Dorothy dozing in the chair beside his bed. "Walter?" he managed to croak. Dorothy stirred immediately, years of motherhood having trained her to wake at the slightest sound. "He's here, Frank. In the hospital." She took his hand gently, but not as a visitor anymore. Frank's brow furrowed with concern, and Dorothy quickly explained Walter's collapse and subsequent diagnosis. As she spoke, Frank's expression shifted from confusion to understanding, and finally, to a complicated grief. "How bad?" he asked simply. "Stage 4 pancreatic cancer," Dorothy replied, not sugarcoating the truth. "They're saying he's likely had symptoms for months, maybe longer." Frank closed his eyes, absorbing this information. When he opened them again, determination had replaced the grief. "I need to see him." "You're in no condition to be wandering the hospital, Frank Miller," Dorothy said firmly. "You're still in the ICU for a reason." "Then get him up here," Frank insisted, his voice stronger than it had been since his admission. Dorothy patted his hand. "We're working on it. The doctors are concerned about infection risks for both of you, but we're convincing them." Meanwhile, 2 floors below, Walter was receiving his first round of chemotherapy. The oncologist had been blunt about his prognosis. The cancer had metastasized to his liver and lungs, making a cure unlikely. The treatment might buy him time, perhaps improve his quality of life, but little more. Walter sat in the treatment chair, watching the clear liquid drip through the IV into his arm. A young nurse monitored his vital signs, making small talk to distract him from the unpleasant anti-nausea medications being administered alongside the chemotherapy. "So you're the man from the viral jacket story," she said, adjusting the flow rate of his IV. "That was quite something, meeting your father's war buddy after all these years." Walter nodded, still wearing Frank's jacket despite the warmth of the hospital room. He'd refused to take it off except when absolutely necessary for medical procedures. "More than a war buddy," he corrected. "My father owed him his life." "And now you're both here," the nurse observed. "Strange how things work out." "Strange isn't the word for it," Walter replied softly. By afternoon, Dorothy had successfully navigated the hospital bureaucracy, convincing Dr. Harrison that the psychological benefits of allowing Walter and Frank to see each other outweighed the physical risks. With strict infection control protocols in place, Walter was wheeled into Frank's ICU room, his own IV pole trailing alongside. The 2 men regarded each other silently for a long moment, both diminished by illness, yet somehow larger than the frail bodies that contained them. "You look terrible," Frank finally said, a ghost of a smile crossing his pale face. "Speak for yourself," Walter replied with equal humor. "At least I have hair." Dorothy excused herself, sensing they needed privacy. As she stepped out, she heard Frank's voice, softer now, asking Walter, Why didn't you get help sooner?" Through the window, she watched as Walter shrugged, looking down at his hands. "The same reason you never talked about the war," she heard him reply. "Pride, shame, the feeling that nobody would really understand." Over the next hour, Dorothy checked on them occasionally, witnessing a conversation that flowed with surprising ease between two men who were virtually strangers, yet connected by invisible threads of shared experience. When she returned with coffee from the cafeteria, Walter was describing his life before homelessness. "I was a high school history teacher for 20 years, he was saying. "After Dad died, something in me just broke. Started drinking, lost my job, then my apartment. My sister tried to help, but I pushed her away. Easier to disappear than to face what I'd become." Frank nodded with understanding that required no explanation. "The war taught me that some things can't be fixed, just carried. But I carried it all alone when I didn't have to." As the days passed, Frank continued his slow recovery while Walter's conditions stabilized enough for his treatments to continue. The hospital staff made special arrangements, bending rules to allow their daily meetings that seemed to benefit both men's recovery more than many of the prescribed medical interventions. During these visits, Frank began to share stories he had never told anyone. Not even Dorothy. He spoke of the night ambushes in Vietnam, the constant fear that eventually became background noise, the crushing responsibility of keeping his men alive in impossible circumstances. "Your father was the funny one," Frank told Walter one afternoon as they played a half-hearted game of chess in his room. "Always had a joke, even when things were at their worst. Said humor was the only weapon Charlie couldn't take from us." Walter moved a pawn without much strategy. He never lost that. Cracked jokes until the end, even when the cancer was eating him alive. He looked up at Frank. "Same cancer that got me, as it happens. Family tradition." Frank studied the chessboard, though his mind was clearly elsewhere. "Your father was the real hero, you know. He saved me before I saved him. I never told anyone that." Walter leaned forward, wincing slightly at the pain in his abdomen. "What do you mean?" Frank's eyes took on a distant look. "We were on patrol. I was point man, wasn't paying enough attention. Viet Cong sniper had me dead to rights." He tapped his chest. "James tackled me just as the shot came. Took one in the shoulder that was meant for my heart." Frank shook his head slowly. 3 days later, he stepped on a mine. I carried him out, but he'd already saved my life. The debt was mine, not his." Walter absorbed this information silently, rearranging his understanding of events his father had described differently. "He never told it that way." "Of course not," Frank replied with a sad smile. "That was James, always making others the heroes of his stories." With Frank's treatment progressing, the medical team expressed cautious optimism about his recovery. Dr. Harrison was particularly impressed with his patient's determination. "I've never seen two more stubborn men," he commented to Dorothy one morning as they stood in the hallway outside Frank's room. "They're literally keeping each other alive." Dorothy smiled tiredly. She'd been splitting her time between the hospital and home, maintaining a constant vigil while also trying to prepare for what would come next. "Stubbornness is the Miller family trait. I suspect the Howards share it." Dr. Harrison glanced through the window where Frank and Walter were engaged in another chess game, this one more animated than the last. "Walter's responding to the treatment better than we anticipated, though his prognosis remains guarded. As for your husband, he's making remarkable progress. If things continue this way, we might be able to move him out of the ICU in the next day or two." 3 months after Frank's collapse in the kitchen, he was finally deemed well enough for discharge. He stood at the hospital entrance in a wheelchair, required by hospital policy despite his protests, Dorothy beside him with a bag of medications and care instructions. His body was thinner, his movements more measured, but the same determination showed in his eyes. "I'll be back tomorrow," he told the nurse who had wheeled him down. "Need to check on Walter." "I'm counting on it, Mr. Miller," she replied with a smile. "He does better on the days you visit." At home, Frank moved slowly through the familiar rooms that somehow seemed different after his long absence. Dorothy watched him carefully, noticing how he paused to touch certain objects. His favorite reading chair, a framed photo of their children, the bookshelf where military history sat gathering dust. That night, after a simple dinner that Frank barely touched, they sat in the living room together, the television off, the silence comfortable but expectant. "I've been thinking," Frank said finally, staring into his cup of tea as if reading tea leaves. "About Walter." Dorothy nodded, having anticipated this conversation. "What about him?" Frank hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. "We have that spare room upstairs." "I already changed the sheets," Dorothy replied with a gentle smile, always one step ahead of her husband. Frank looked up, surprise and gratitude mingling in his expression. "You knew what I was going to ask?" "Frank Miller. I've been married to you for 40 years. Of course I knew." She reached across and took his hand. "Walter needs a home when he's discharged, and we have the space. It makes perfect sense." The next morning, Frank insisted on driving himself to the hospital, despite Dorothy's concerns. He found Walter sitting up in bed, looking marginally better than the day before, a notebook open on his lap. "What's that you're working on?" Frank asked, settling into the chair beside the bed. Walter closed the notebook slightly, almost embarrassed. "Just writing some things down. Stories my father told me, things we've talked about. Figured someone should record it all." Frank nodded approval. "Good idea. Too many stories get lost." They fell into easy conversation about Walter's treatment progress and Frank's first night back home. Neither man was demonstrative by nature, yet a comfortable camaraderie had developed between them that required no explanation or analysis. As Frank was preparing to leave, he pulled something from his jacket pocket, a carefully wrapped package. "What's this?" Walter asked as Frank placed it on the bed. "Open it and see." Walter unwrapped the package to find Frank's military jacket, cleaned and repaired, the name Miller still clearly embroidered on the chest. "This belongs to you," Frank said simply. Walter shook his head. "No, it belongs to a soldier." "Exactly," Frank replied, picking up the jacket and placing it around Walter's shoulders. "A soldier is someone who fights battles, and you've been fighting yours too long on your own." Late that night, Dorothy found Frank standing at the window of their bedroom, staring out at the clear night sky. His expression was thoughtful, almost peaceful, a look she hadn't seen on his face in years. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, wrapping her arms around him from behind, careful of his still healing body. Frank covered her hands with his own. "About time. How strange it moves. How 50 years can feel like yesterday, and yesterday can feel like forever." Dorothy rested her cheek against his shoulder. "Having regrets?" "No," Frank said after a moment. "Just wondering why it took me so long to understand some things." They stood in silence, watching the stars through the window. Finally, Frank turned to face her, his expression serious. "There's something I need to tell you, something I've never told anyone, about the last night in Vietnam and why I can't forgive myself." Frank sat on the edge of the hospital bed, his weathered hands clasped tightly between his knees. Dorothy settled beside him, her presence both comforting and somehow making this confession more difficult. The hospital room was quiet, save for the distant beeping of monitors and the occasional announcement over the PA system. "I've never told anyone the full story," Frank began, his voice low and rough. "Not the Army, not the VA doctors, not even James when he was alive." Dorothy placed her hand on his arm, a silent encouragement to continue. Frank took a deep breath, his eyes focused on some distant point beyond the hospital walls. "It was our last patrol. We were 3 days from rotating home, me, James, and 4 others from our unit. Frank's voice took on a hollow quality, as if he were reading from a report rather than recounting his own memories. We weren't supposed to be out there at all. Command had ordered us to stand down, but our lieutenant wanted one more sweep of the area. The memory unfolded in vivid detail. Dense jungle, humid air thick enough to choke on, the constant buzz of insects providing white noise that occasionally masked more dangerous sounds. I was on point that day. James was right behind me. Frank's fingers twitched involuntarily. We'd been walking for hours, and I was getting sloppy, thinking about home, about seeing you again, not paying attention like I should have been. He described how the jungle had suddenly gone quiet, a warning sign any experienced soldier would recognize. But Frank had missed it, his mind thousands of miles away. James noticed. He always had better instincts than me. Frank's voice cracked slightly. He hissed at me to get down, but I was distracted, didn't react fast enough. That's when he tackled me from behind. The shot had cracked through the air a split second later, the bullet tearing through James's shoulder instead of Frank's heart. What followed was chaos, returned fire, shouted commands, the adrenaline of combat pushing everything else aside. We managed to fight them off, but James was losing blood fast. We were miles from our extraction point with a wounded man and hostiles in the area. Frank shook his head. The lieutenant wanted to call in a medevac, but we knew it would take too long, and a helicopter would draw attention we couldn't afford. Dorothy listened silently, finally understanding why her husband woke some nights gasping for air, reaching for weapons that weren't there. So we started walking. I carried James across my shoulders. The others covered our flanks. Frank's gaze dropped to his hands. What none of us knew was that we'd wandered into a minefield, one that wasn't on any of our maps. Frank described how they realized their mistake too late when one of the men, Rodriguez, stepped on a CE mine. The explosion took his life instantly and wounded 2 others. Suddenly, we were down to me and one other guy who could walk, with 3 wounded. Frank's breathing had become shallow, as if the weight of James was once again on his shoulders. And we were standing in the middle of a minefield, with no clear way out. Dorothy squeezed his arm gently. "How did you get through it?" "Inch by inch," Frank replied. "I had James across my shoulders, and he was going in and out of consciousness from blood loss. I was terrified he'd die before we got out. Terrified I'd step on a mine and kill us both." Frank explained how he had started singing, softly at first, then louder as the tension became unbearable. "Bridge over troubled water." It had just come out recently, and James had played it constantly on his portable tape player. I sang to keep him awake, to keep myself focused. James would mumble the lyrics when he was conscious, tell me I was singing it wrong when he wasn't in too much pain. A ghost of a smile crossed Frank's face. He said my singing was so bad it kept him fighting just so he could make it stop. They had made it through the minefield, Frank leading the way with James on his shoulders, the remaining able-bodied soldier helping the other wounded men follow exactly in Frank's footsteps. When we finally reached safe ground, a patrol found us. They got us to a field hospital. Frank's voice dropped. I was with James until they prepped him for evacuation. He gave me his medal, told me to take it home to his family, said he had something important to tell me when the morphine wore off. Frank fell silent, his shoulders hunched under an invisible burden. "What happened next?" Dorothy prompted gently. "I passed out from exhaustion. When I woke up, James had already been evacuated. In the confusion, I left his medal behind." Frank's voice was thick with self-loathing. "I promised him I'd get it to his family, and I failed. Then everything happened so fast. I was shipped home 2 days later, met you soon after, and tried to put it all behind me." Dorothy processed this information, seeing how this unfulfilled promise had festered in her husband's conscience for 5 decades. "Did you ever try to find James after the war?" Frank nodded. A few times in the early years. The military wasn't great about keeping records of where everyone ended up. Then life got busy. Our kids, my job. Eventually, I convinced myself it was better to leave the past buried. He looked up at her, his eyes red-rimmed. But it was never buried, Dorothy. Just hidden away where I thought it couldn't hurt anyone but me. The next morning, Walter received mixed news about his cancer treatment. Dr. Harrison sat at the edge of his bed, reviewing test results with measured optimism. The primary tumor has responded to the treatment better than we expected, he explained, pointing to the scan images. However, we're seeing some concerning developments in your liver function. Walter absorbed this information with the stoicism that had become his trademark. What does that mean in plain English, Doc? It means we're making progress against the cancer itself, but your body is struggling with the side effects of the treatment. Dr. Harrison closed the file. We need to discuss next steps. There's an experimental immunotherapy trial that might be beneficial in your case, but it costs a fortune and isn't covered by whatever charity program is currently paying for my treatment. Walter finished for him. Dr. Harrison nodded reluctantly. Unfortunately, yes. The trial costs are substantial, and there's a waiting list for the limited charity spots. From the corridor, Frank observed this conversation through the partially open door. His face hardened with resolve as he listened to Walter and the doctor discuss financial realities that seemed cruelly disconnected from the life and death stakes they represented. When the doctor left, Frank entered Walter's room, his movements still careful but his purpose evident in his posture. "How much did you hear?" Walter asked, noting Frank's expression. "Enough." Frank sat in the visitor's chair, wincing slightly as his still-healing body protested. "I'm calling my lawyer today." Walter frowned. "Why would you need a lawyer?" "To arrange some financial matters." Frank's tone was matter-of-fact. "I've got a decent retirement fund, veterans benefits, some investments that Dorothy insisted on years ago that turned out better than I expected." Walter's eyes widened as he understood. "Absolutely not, Frank. I won't take your money." "It's not for you," Frank replied stubbornly. "It's for me, so I can finally sleep at night knowing I paid my debt to your father." "There is no debt," Walter insisted, his voice rising. "Whatever you think you owe my father was settled 50 years ago in that minefield." Frank shook his head firmly. "Some debts take half a century to pay." Later that afternoon, Frank made several phone calls from his hospital room before being discharged. His lawyer arrived shortly after lunch, a trim woman in her 40s with an efficient manner and a briefcase full of documents. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Mr. Miller?" she asked as she spread papers across the hospital tray table. "This represents a significant portion of your retirement savings." "I'm certain," Frank replied, reaching for the pen she offered. Dorothy entered as he was signing the papers, her expression a mixture of concern and resignation. "Frank, should we discuss this first? What about our own security?" she asked quietly. Frank looked up at his wife, his face softening. "Dorothy, for 50 years I've carried this weight. If I don't do this now, I'll regret it forever." He took her hand. "We'll be fine. The house is paid off and we still have our Social Security and half the investments. This is something I need to do." Dorothy squeezed his hand, recognizing the peace in his eyes that had been absent for as long as she'd known him. "Then do it." When Walter discovered that Frank had arranged to pay for his experimental treatment, his reaction was explosive. From down the hospital corridor, nurses could hear his angry protests. "I didn't tell you my situation so you could bankrupt yourself," Walter shouted, his face flushed with emotion. "This is exactly why I lived on the streets instead of asking for help. I refuse to be anyone's charity case." Frank stood his ground, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You're right. You're not a charity case. You're family. And family takes care of each other." Walter fell silent. The word family hitting him harder than any argument could have. The day Frank was discharged from the hospital, he insisted on walking out under his own power, rejecting the wheelchair the nurse brought. Dorothy hovered nearby, ready to support him if needed, but respecting his need to demonstrate this small independence. "I'll be back tomorrow," Frank told the nursing staff who had gathered to see him off. "We'll be expecting you, Mr. Miller," the head nurse replied with a smile. "Walter has physical therapy at 10 a.m., so plan accordingly." As Frank prepared to leave, Dr. Harrison approached him discreetly, gesturing him aside with a concerned expression. "Mr. Miller, could I have a word before you go?" The doctor led Frank to a quiet alcove near the exit, his voice lowered. "We need to discuss something immediately." Frank nodded, expecting last-minute discharge instructions or medication adjustments. "Mr. Miller, we found something in your latest test that needs immediate attention," Dr. Harrison said, his expression grave. "Something related to your heart that wasn't there when you were first admitted." Frank followed Dr. Harrison into a small consultation room, his momentary elation at being discharged quickly fading. On the computer monitor, the doctor pulled up several images of Frank's heart, pointing to areas that meant nothing to Frank's untrained eyes, but clearly concerned the physician. "These scans show progressive heart failure, Mr. Miller," Dr. Harrison explained, his voice gentle but direct. "The damage appears to have been developing for years, likely related to your Vietnam service and exposure to Agent Orange. However, the recent pneumonia and physical stress have significantly accelerated the deterioration." Frank stared at the images, the rhythmic beating of his heart, suddenly very present in his consciousness. "How bad is it?" "Without significant intervention, including possibly a surgical procedure, your heart will continue to weaken." Dr. Harrison met Frank's eyes directly. "We're looking at months, maybe a year at most, without surgery." Frank absorbed this information with the same stoicism he'd carried through war. "What kind of surgery?" "A valve replacement at minimum, possibly more, depending on what we find. It's a major procedure, especially for someone your age with your medical history." The doctor handed Frank a folder of information. "We should schedule this within the next 2 to 3 months." Frank took the folder mechanically, already making calculations in his head. Walter's experimental treatment would take at least that long. The money he'd allocated wouldn't cover both. "I need you to keep this between us," Frank said firmly. Dr. Harrison frowned. "Mr. Miller, your family should—" "My wife has been through enough worry," Frank interrupted, "and Walter needs to focus on his own recovery. I'm not asking you to lie, just delay until Walter's treatment is secured." The doctor's discomfort was evident. "I can't withhold critical information from your wife if she asks directly about your condition." "She won't ask what she doesn't suspect," Frank replied. "Please, I need time to handle this my way." Against his better judgment, Dr. Harrison reluctantly agreed to respect Frank's wishes for now, extracting a promise that Frank would take his prescribed medications and return for weekly monitoring. As Frank left the consultation room, he slipped the heart medications into his pocket, away from Dorothy's watchful eyes. His military training in compartmentalization, the ability to lock away fears and concerns to deal with the immediate mission, had never been more valuable. Dorothy drove them home in silence, sensing something had changed, but knowing her husband well enough not to press him in his current state. The familiar streets of their neighborhood seemed different somehow, as if Frank were seeing them through the lens of limited time. At home, Frank moved carefully through the rooms, touching objects with newfound appreciation. The worn banister he'd meant to replace for years, Dorothy's collection of bird figurines that had always secretly annoyed him, but now seemed precious in their ordinariness. "I've prepared the guest room for Walter," Dorothy mentioned as she helped Frank settle into his recliner. "Changed the sheets, cleared some closet space." Frank nodded appreciatively. "He'll protest coming here," Say he doesn't want to be a burden." "I'll handle Walter," Dorothy said with the confidence of a woman who'd been managing stubborn men her entire life. "You focus on getting stronger." Over the next few days, Frank established a new routine. Mornings spent regaining his strength at home, afternoons visiting Walter at the hospital. He hid his heart medications among the various pills he'd been prescribed for his recovery, taking them when Dorothy wasn't watching. The effort of concealing his condition sometimes exhausted him more than the condition itself. During his daily visits, Frank watched with satisfaction as Walter showed gradual signs of improvement. The experimental treatment had begun, and though it left Walter nauseous and fatigued, the oncologists were cautiously positive about his initial response. "Tell me more about your father," Frank prompted during one visit, settling into the chair beside Walter's bed. "Not the war stories, the after, the life he built." Walter, paler than usual after his latest treatment, seemed to draw energy from the memories. He was a carpenter, built half the houses in our neighborhood with his own hands. He smiled faintly. "Had this habit of singing while he worked. Terrible voice, just like you." "Military specialty," Frank joked. "They recruited us for our inability to carry a tune." As Walter spoke about his father, the fishing trips, the woodworking lessons, the way he volunteered at the local VA despite his own struggles, Frank filled in gaps in his own memory, constructing a complete picture of the man whose life had been so intertwined with his own. "He talked about you," Walter admitted. "Not often, but sometimes when he'd had a few beers. He'd say, 'There's a man walking around who gave me this life and he doesn't even know it.'" Frank swallowed hard against the emotion rising in his throat. "I knew," he said quietly. "I just didn't feel worthy of it." On his way out of Walter's room, Frank experienced a sudden episode of breathlessness, leaning against the wall as black spots danced in his vision. A passing nurse noticed immediately. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked, moving quickly to support him. Frank straightened, forcing his breathing to normalize through sheer willpower. "Just stood up too fast," he lied. "Still getting my strength back." The nurse didn't look convinced, but didn't press the issue. "Take it slow, Mr. Miller. Recovery isn't a race." But it was a race. Against time, against the failing muscle in his chest, against the financial limitations that forced an impossible choice between Walter's treatment and his own surgery. At home, Dorothy found the unfamiliar prescription bottle while putting away laundry. The medication name, a complex pharmaceutical term, meant nothing to her, but the warning label suggested something serious. Concerned, she researched it online, discovering it was commonly prescribed for advanced heart failure. The next morning, Dorothy cornered Dr. Harrison in the hospital corridor, her expression leaving no room for evasion. "My husband has heart failure, doesn't he?" she demanded without preamble. The doctor's discomfort was immediate and obvious. "Mrs. Miller, I'm bound by confidentiality." "I've been married to that man for 40 years, Dorothy interrupted. "I know when he's hiding something serious. I found his medication." Dr. Harrison sighed heavily. "I cannot violate your husband's confidentiality, but I would strongly suggest you pay attention to the signs and talk to Frank directly." Dorothy's eyes narrowed. "He made you promise not to tell me." The doctor's silence was confirmation enough. Meanwhile, in Walter's room, the two men had abandoned pretense of playing chess, instead engaged in a philosophical conversation about moral debts and forgiveness. "The thing about debts," Walter said, moving a knight without strategy, "is that sometimes the lender doesn't want repayment. Sometimes the act of trying to repay changes the nature of what was given freely in the first place." Frank considered this, studying the board without seeing it. Maybe, or maybe some debts can only be repaid in kind, one life for another. Walter looked up sharply. "What does that mean?" Frank waved the question away. "Just philosophical ramblings of an old soldier." Walter revealed that he had begun writing a journal documenting both his father's stories and his recent conversations with Frank, Someone should preserve these memories, he explained, showing Frank the leather-bound notebook filled with neat handwriting. History gets lost in the gaps between generations. Frank was touched by the gesture, recognizing it as Walter's own way of creating legacy and meaning from their unexpected connection. Later that afternoon, while Walter was undergoing treatment, Frank visited the hospital chapel, not from any particular religious conviction, but seeking a quiet place to think. The simple room with its wooden pews and stained glass provided a sanctuary from the constant medical bustle. As he sat contemplating his situation, Frank experienced another cardiac episode, stronger this time, a vice-like pressure in his chest that left him gasping. He fumbled for his medication, swallowing the pills dry and focusing on his breathing until the pain subsided. No one had witnessed this incident, a small mercy he was grateful for. What Frank didn't realize was that Dorothy had seen him enter the chapel and had watched through the small window in the door, noting his pallor and labored breathing with growing alarm. That evening, after a quiet dinner that Frank barely touched, Dorothy observed her husband carefully, the careful way he moved to hide his discomfort, the slight wincing when he thought she wasn't looking, the fatigue that seemed to settle more deeply each day. Frank caught her watching him. "What?" "Nothing," she replied, turning away to wash the dishes. "Just thinking about how stubborn you are." Frank chuckled softly. Pot, kettle. They settled into their evening routine, Dorothy with her book, Frank pretending to watch the news while actually watching Dorothy, memorizing the familiar lines of her face. The following morning brought exhaustion greater than Frank had yet experienced. The effort of maintaining his facade was taking its toll, but the weekly reports on Walter's treatment showed promising results, worth every moment of discomfort and deception in Frank's calculation. During his hospital visit, Frank brought old photographs he'd dug out of storage, snapshots from basic training and a few rare images from Vietnam. Walter examined them with reverence, occasionally identifying soldiers his father had mentioned. As Frank was leaving Walter's room, he felt a now familiar tightness in his chest. He made it to the men's bathroom just as the pain intensified, gripping the sink as sweat beaded on his forehead. After taking his medication, he splashed cold water on his face and waited for the episode to pass, grateful again that no one had witnessed his weakness. When he finally emerged, steadier but drained, he nearly collided with Dorothy, who stood in the corridor with her arms folded and eyes suspiciously red. "Ready to go home?" he asked, attempting normalcy. Dorothy nodded silently, her gaze assessing him with an intensity that suggested she saw far more than he was comfortable revealing. That night, Frank awoke to find Dorothy's side of the bed empty. Following the soft glow of light, he found her in the kitchen, sorting through old photo albums with tears tracking silently down her cheeks. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked gently. She looked up, making no effort to hide her tears. "Just thinking about time. How precious it is. How easily we waste it keeping secrets from the people we love most." Frank felt the weight of her words, but couldn't bring himself to surrender just yet. Walter's treatment was showing results. He just needed a little more time to ensure it would continue. After a tiring day at the hospital the following week, Frank opened the front door to find an unexpected visitor seated in his living room with Dorothy. An older man with military posture, wearing a blazer with veterans' pins on the lapel. In his hands was a weathered metal box bearing military insignia that Frank recognized immediately. "Frank," Dorothy said softly, "you remember Colonel Richards from your unit." The colonel stood, extending his hand. "It's been a long time, Miller. Saw your picture in that viral story about giving your jacket to a homeless vet. Never thought I'd find you after all these years." Frank stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move as he stared at Colonel Richards. Though now in his 80s, the man still maintained the ramrod-straight posture of a career military officer. His white hair was cropped short, in the same crew cut he'd worn in Vietnam, and his eyes retained the piercing quality that had commanded respect from everyone in the unit. "Colonel," Frank finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper, "this is, unexpected." Richards nodded, a slight smile softening his otherwise stern features. "When I saw that viral story about a Vietnam vet giving his jacket to a homeless man during a blizzard, I thought the miller on that jacket looked familiar. Took some digging to confirm it was you." Frank moved slowly into the living room, lowering himself carefully into his armchair. Dorothy watched him with concern, noting how his hand unconsciously moved to his chest as he sat down. "It's been, what, 50 years?" Frank asked, still processing the shock of seeing his former commanding officer in his living room. 52, Richards corrected, military precision evident even now. He gestured to the metal box on the coffee table between them. "I've been holding on to something that belongs to you." Frank's eyes fixed on the box, recognition dawning across his features. The faded insignia of their unit was still visible on its surface, alongside scratches and dents accumulated through decades of storage. "What is that?" Dorothy asked, looking between the two men. Richards opened the box carefully, revealing several military medals nestled in faded velvet. "Decorations that your husband refused to accept after the war." Dorothy turned to Frank with surprise. "You never told me you were awarded medals." "I didn't accept them," Frank said quietly, his eyes never leaving the box. "Didn't feel right." Richards removed a bronze star from the collection, holding it up so the afternoon light caught its surface. "This one was for carrying 3 wounded men through a minefield while under enemy fire. Command wanted to put you in for a silver star, but you disappeared as soon as your tour ended." Dorothy's eyes widened as she stared at her husband. 50 years of marriage, and she was still learning about the man she'd shared her life with. "There's more," Richards continued, lifting a folded piece of paper from beneath the medals. "Before James Howard was evacuated, he specifically requested that you receive a commendation. He made me promise to ensure you got the recognition." Frank's head snapped up. "James asked for that before they flew him out?" Richards nodded solemnly. "He was adamant about it, even while they were prepping him for evacuation. Said you saved not just him, but 6 other men during that ambush." Frank lowered his head, unable to accept what he considered undeserved praise. "I was just doing my job, same as anyone would have." "No," Richards said firmly. "Not same as anyone would have. What you did was exceptional, Miller. Always was. That's why Howard insisted I put you in for the decoration." Dorothy moved to sit on the arm of Frank's chair, her hand resting supportively on his shoulder. She could feel the tension radiating through him, the weight of memories pressing down with almost physical force. "I couldn't accept them then," Frank said after a long silence. "Still don't know if I can now." Richards closed the box and pushed it across the table toward Frank. "They're yours, whether you accept them or not. I'm just fulfilling a promise I made to James and to myself." That night, after the colonel had left and Dorothy had gone to bed, Frank sat alone in the dim light of the living room, the metal box open before him. His fingers traced the edges of the bronze star, feeling its weight both physically and metaphorically. For decades, he had carried the burden of what he considered unearned honors, believing he had merely survived while better men had died or suffered. The next morning, Frank brought the box of medals with him to the hospital. Walter was sitting up in bed, his color slightly improved after his latest treatment. The experimental therapy seemed to be working, though the side effects left him exhausted. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Walter commented as Frank entered the room. "Something like that," Frank replied, setting the metal box on the bedside table. "Had a visitor yesterday, my old commanding officer." Walter's eyebrows rose with interest. "From Vietnam? After all these years?" Frank nodded, opening the box to reveal the medals inside. "He brought these, said I earned them, but I refused to accept them after the war." Walter leaned forward to examine the decorations, his expression thoughtful. My father mentioned something about you turning down medals. Said it was the most stubborn damn thing he'd ever seen, and he'd seen a lot of stubborn. Frank managed a small smile at that. Your father wasn't exactly flexible himself. As they were discussing the medals, Dr. Harrison entered with an unusually bright expression. Good news, Mr. Howard. Your latest scans show the tumor is responding exceptionally well to the experimental treatment. If this continues, we might be looking at significant remission. Walter's face lit up with cautious hope, while Frank felt a wave of vindication for his decision to finance the treatment. This was exactly what he'd hoped for, a chance for Walter to reclaim his life. As Frank stood to shake the doctor's hand, a sudden wave of dizziness washed over him. He reached for the wall to steady himself, his face draining of color. Frank? Walter's voice seemed to come from far away. Are you all right? Frank blinked several times, forcing the room back into focus. Just stood up too quickly, he muttered, the same excuse becoming well-worn. Walter studied him with concern, noting the pallor that had suddenly overtaken Frank's complexion. You don't look well. I'm fine, Frank insisted, straightening up with effort. Just excited about your good news. He quickly shifted the conversation back to the medals, picking up one particular decoration that had been set apart from the others. This one is special, he explained, showing Walter. Your father recommended me for it personally. Walter took the medal carefully, examining the inscription with reverence. He never told me about this. That was James, Frank said softly, always making others the heroes in his stories. Later that afternoon, as Frank was preparing to leave, Dorothy arrived for her daily visit. She pulled Dr. Harrison aside in the corridor, her worry evident in every line of her face. He's getting worse, isn't he? She asked without preamble. Frank, I mean, his heart. Dr. Harrison's professional demeanor slipped slightly, revealing his own concern. Mrs. Miller, you know I can't discuss. Please, Dorothy interrupted. I'm watching my husband fade before my eyes, and he won't admit anything's wrong. I found his medications. I've seen how he clutches his chest when he thinks no one's looking. I need to know what we're dealing with. The doctor sighed, clearly conflicted. I can only suggest that you watch for warning signs, shortness of breath, unusual fatigue, swelling in the extremities, and I strongly encourage Frank to be honest with you about his condition. Dorothy nodded, understanding the constraints of medical ethics, while frustration simmered beneath her calm exterior. Thank you, Doctor. Back in Walter's room, Frank was showing him an old photograph from the metal box, a group shot of their platoon, young faces trying to look tough while fear lurked behind their eyes. That's your father. Frank pointed to a tall, smiling soldier with his arm slung around a younger Frank's shoulders, always keeping morale up even in the worst places. Walter studied the image intently. You both look so young. Hard to believe you were carrying the weight of life and death decisions. We all grew up fast over there, Frank replied, his voice distant with memory. Walter noticed how Frank's hand trembled slightly as he held the photograph, how his breathing seemed more labored than it had been during previous visits. Frank, he said cautiously, is there something you're not telling me about your health? Frank's expression closed like a shutter. Just still recovering from the pneumonia. Nothing to worry about. Walter wasn't convinced, but he recognized the stubborn set of Frank's jaw, the same expression his father used to get when he'd made up his mind about something. That evening, Frank observed Walter sleeping peacefully, his breathing steady and deeper than it had been in weeks. The experimental treatment was working. Walter had a fighting chance now. Frank slipped a pain pill into his mouth when he was sure no one was watching, grimacing at the bitter taste as he swallowed it dry. Just a few more weeks, he whispered to himself, a mantra he repeated whenever the pain became too intense or the breathlessness too frightening. As Frank prepared to leave, Dorothy arrived to drive him home. She watched him from the doorway, noting how he steadied himself on the furniture as he moved, how each breath seemed to require conscious effort. On the drive home, they maintained a companionable silence, the radio playing softly in the background. Frank stared out the window, watching their neighborhood pass by with an intensity that suggested he was memorizing every detail. When they arrived home, Dorothy went straight to the kitchen and began preparing dinner. Frank followed, leaning against the doorframe as he watched her efficient movements. "Dorothy," he began, then paused, unsure how to continue. She turned, wooden spoon in hand, her expression open and waiting. "Thank you," he said finally, "for everything, for these years, for understanding what I couldn't say." Dorothy set down the spoon and crossed to him, placing her palm gently against his cheek. "Frank Miller, I've known you were keeping things from me since the day we met. It's part of loving you, accepting the silences alongside the words." Frank covered her hand with his own, overwhelmed by the simple understanding she offered. How had he been fortunate enough to find her? How had he deserved such grace? When they arrived at the kitchen that night, Frank found Dorothy sitting at the table with all his heart medications aligned in neat rows before her. Her eyes were red from crying, but her expression was set with determination as she looked up at him. "Enough secrets, Frank," she said firmly. "Either you tell Walter about your heart, or I will." Frank sank heavily into the kitchen chair across from Dorothy, the medications between them like a battlefield of small plastic sentinels. He ran his weathered hand over his face, the facade he'd maintained for weeks, finally crumbling beneath his wife's unwavering gaze. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "For certain. Since I found your pills last week." Dorothy pushed a bottle of heart medication forward with her finger. "But I've suspected something was wrong since the day you came home from the hospital. You've never been good at hiding things from me, Frank." Frank stared at the neat rows of prescription bottles, each one a testament to his failing heart, each label bearing his name and the instructions he'd been secretly following. The game was over. "The pneumonia damaged my heart," he admitted, "but Dr. Harrison says it was already compromised from years from Vietnam, the Agent Orange exposure." "And you need surgery," Dorothy stated rather than asked. "Surgery you've been postponing because of Walter's treatment costs." Frank nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "I couldn't do both, and Walter's chance was more important. James would have wanted—" "Don't you dare," Dorothy interrupted, her voice sharp with emotion. "Don't you dare hide behind what James would have wanted. This isn't about James or a 50-year-old debt. This is about you choosing to die rather than let me help make decisions that affect both our lives." The harsh truth of her words hit Frank like physical blows. For weeks, he'd convinced himself his deception was noble, a final act of repayment to a man who'd saved his life. Now, faced with Dorothy's pain, he recognized the selfishness embedded in his sacrifice. 50 years of marriage, Dorothy continued, tears forming in her eyes, "and you still don't trust me enough to face this together." "It's not about trust," Frank protested weakly. "Then what is it about?" Frank had no answer that wouldn't sound hollow, even to himself. "Tomorrow morning," Dorothy said, her voice steadier now, "we're going to Walter's room together, and you're going to tell him everything. No more secrets. No more martyrdom." Frank opened his mouth to object, but found he no longer had the energy to fight. Perhaps it was relief that flooded through him. The peculiar lightness that comes when a burden carried too long is finally shared. "All right," he conceded softly. "Tomorrow." The next morning arrived with gray skies and a fine mist that seemed to hang suspended over the city. Frank dressed slowly, each button a deliberate action, requiring concentration. Dorothy watched from the doorway, her expression softened from the previous night's confrontation, but still resolute. "Ready?" she asked when he finally turned to her. Frank nodded, though ready was the furthest thing from how he felt. The hospital corridor seemed longer than usual as they made their way to Walter's room. Dorothy walked slightly ahead, as if afraid Frank might turn and flee if given the opportunity. His heart felt heavy in his chest, both metaphorically and, he noted with grim humor, literally. Walter was sitting up in bed when they entered, looking better than he had in weeks. The experimental treatment was clearly working. Color had returned to his face, and he was writing energetically in the journal he kept. "Well, if it isn't the Millers," Walter greeted them with a smile that faded quickly as he registered their serious expressions. "What's wrong?" Dorothy gave Frank a pointed look, then moved to close the door, ensuring their privacy. Frank lowered himself carefully into the chair beside Walter's bed, gathering his courage. "I haven't been entirely honest with you," Frank began, his voice steadier than he expected, "about my condition." Walter set his journal aside, giving Frank his full attention. "What do you mean?" "My heart is failing," Frank stated plainly. "The pneumonia accelerated the damage, but Dr. Harrison says it's been happening for years, likely related to Agent Orange exposure in Vietnam." Walter's expression shifted from confusion to shock to anger in rapid succession. "How long have you known?" "Since I was discharged from the hospital." "And you didn't tell me?" Walter's voice rose. "While you were arranging to pay for my treatment?" Frank looked down at his hands, unable to face the accusation in Walter's eyes. "I made a choice." "A choice?" Walter repeated incredulously. "You mean you chose to potentially kill yourself to pay for my treatment? What kind of choice is that?" Dorothy moved to stand behind Frank, her hand resting supportively on his shoulder despite her own anger with him. "That's what I've been trying to tell him." Walter struggled to sit up straighter, wincing slightly from the lingering pain of his condition. "How bad is it, Frank? Tell me straight." Frank met Walter's gaze directly. "Without surgery, Dr. Harrison gives me a year at most. With the surgery," he shrugged, "better odds, but no guarantees." "And when were you planning to have this surgery?" Walter demanded, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "After your treatment course was complete," Frank admitted. "When we knew it was working." Walter stared at him in disbelief before exploding. "Don't you dare die for me, Miller. My father didn't save you in that jungle so you could throw your life away 50 years later on some misguided sense of obligation." The force of Walter's outburst startled both Frank and Dorothy. In the weeks they'd known him, Walter had been unfailingly gentle in his speech, his anger turned inward rather than outward. Now his face flushed with righteous indignation. "That's not what this is about," Frank protested weakly. "The hell it isn't," Walter shot back. "You've been carrying this guilt complex around for half a century, and now you think dying will finally balance the scales. That's not how debts work, Frank. That's not how life works." A young nurse appeared at the door, drawn by the raised voices. "Is everything all right in here?" "Fine," Dorothy assured her quickly. "Just a family discussion." Family. The word hung in the air after the nurse departed, reinforcing the strange bonds that had formed between them in such a short time. Dr. Harrison entered moments later, his timing either unfortunate or deliberate. He took in the tense scene with a practiced eye. "I see the truth has come out," he observed, closing the door behind him. "You knew about this?" Walter demanded. The doctor nodded. "Patient confidentiality prevented me from discussing it with you, but yes, I've been monitoring Frank's condition weekly." "And how bad is it really?" Walter asked, not trusting Frank to be completely forthcoming even now. Dr. Harrison sighed, looking to Frank for permission to speak freely. When Frank nodded, the doctor explained in clear medical terms the severity of Frank's heart condition, the risks of delaying surgery, and the urgency of the situation. "In my professional opinion," Dr. Harrison concluded, "the procedure cannot be safely postponed beyond 2 weeks." Walter listened with growing horror, the full implications of Frank's deception becoming clear. When the doctor finished, Walter turned to Frank with tears in his eyes. "You stubborn old fool," he whispered. "You were going to let yourself die." "Not die," Frank corrected. "Just take a calculated risk." "For me?" Walter's voice broke. "I'm not worth that, Frank. Nobody is." "Your father was," Frank replied simply. Walter shook his head vehemently. "My father would kick your ass if he were here. He didn't take that bullet so you could throw away the life he saved." The truth of this statement hit Frank with unexpected force. He'd spent decades viewing his survival as a debt owed rather than a gift given. A fundamental misunderstanding of what James Howard had done for him that day in the jungle. An uncomfortable silence filled the room, broken only by the steady beeping of Walter's monitors. Finally, Walter spoke again, his voice calmer, but no less determined. "I'm going to talk to the hospital administration about payment options. There has to be a way to cover both treatments." "Walter, that's not—" Frank began. "Shut up, Frank," Walter interrupted, but without malice. "It's my turn to make decisions. You've been making them all yourself for too long." Dorothy squeezed Frank's shoulder in silent agreement. Later that afternoon, Walter insisted on speaking with the hospital's financial counselors, despite still being connected to his own treatment IVs. From his bed, he worked tirelessly on his laptop, researching veteran assistance programs, clinical trials for heart procedures, and charitable foundations that might help. Frank watched him with a mixture of admiration and guilt. "He's as stubborn as his father," he murmured to Dorothy as they observed Walter's determined efforts from the hallway. "Like recognizes like," she replied dryly. That evening, Dr. Harrison met with Frank and Dorothy in a formal consultation room, his expression grave as he emphasized the timeline they were facing. "I understand the financial concerns," he said. "But medically speaking, we cannot delay your surgery beyond 2 weeks, Mr. Miller. The risk of catastrophic heart failure increases significantly with each passing day." Dorothy gripped Frank's hand tightly. "Then we do it in 2 weeks, regardless of what arrangements we've made by then." Frank nodded, finally accepting the reality of his situation. 2 weeks, he agreed. Later that night, after Dorothy had fallen asleep in the chair beside Walter's bed, Frank stood at the window, looking out at the city lights. Walter watched him from the bed, noting how the older man's shoulders slumped with exhaustion and relief, the peculiar relief that comes when one finally surrenders a burden carried too long. "You know what's funny?" Walter said softly, so as not to wake Dorothy. "All these years, you've been trying to repay a debt to my father that he never thought existed. And now, I'm trying to save you, creating a whole new cycle." Frank turned from the window, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Maybe that's how it works. Maybe we're not meant to repay debts, just pass them forward." When Frank and Dorothy left for the night, Walter waited until their footsteps faded down the corridor. Then, with careful movements, he disconnected his chemotherapy IV, the monitor quieted by a carefully placed clip. He dressed silently in the clothes Dorothy had brought for him, movements practiced from his earlier reconnaissance of the night staff's routines. With a clear purpose in mind, Walter slipped out of his room and navigated the quiet hospital corridors to the emergency exit. He had a mission: to find someone he hadn't seen in decades, who might be the only person capable of saving both himself and Frank. The morning light filtered through the hospital windows, casting long shadows across the empty bed in Walter's room. The night nurse stood frozen, staring at the disconnected IV line swinging gently from its stand, the chemotherapy solution dripping onto the floor in a small puddle. "Code yellow," she called into the intercom, her voice steady despite the alarm in her eyes. "We have a missing patient on oncology, room 342. Within minutes, the hospital's missing patient protocol activated, security guards checking exits, while nurses searched nearby rooms and bathrooms. The commotion quickly reached Dorothy and Frank as they arrived for their morning visit. coffee cups dropping from their hands when they saw the flurry of activity around Walter's empty room. "What happened?" Dorothy demanded, grabbing the arm of the charge nurse who emerged from Walter's bathroom. "Where is he?" "Mrs. Miller, we don't know yet," the nurse admitted. "It appears Mr. Howard left sometime during the night. His medication port was properly disconnected, which suggests he knew what he was doing." Frank stood silently in the doorway, his face ashen with shock and guilt. "This is my fault," he finally said. "He left because of what I told him yesterday." The hospital security team interviewed them immediately, asking about possible locations Walter might have gone. Frank described Walter's background as a homeless man, his former teaching career, and the limited information he had about Walter's estranged family. He mentioned a sister once, Frank recalled, but said they hadn't spoken in over a decade. Police were notified, though without evidence of foul play or immediate danger to himself. Walter's disappearance was classified as a voluntary departure, concerning given his medical condition, but not a high priority for overworked officers. Frank's condition deteriorated rapidly under the stress of Walter's disappearance. By afternoon, he was experiencing chest pains severe enough that Dr. Harrison insisted on admitting him. "Your heart can't take this level of stress," the doctor explained, as nurses connected Frank to cardiac monitors in the same ICU where he'd spent weeks recovering from pneumonia. "Your ejection fraction is dangerously low." Dorothy divided her time between keeping vigil at Frank's bedside and working with hospital security to locate Walter. She provided them with photographs from Frank's phone, pictures of Walter smiling weakly from his hospital bed, images that now decorated missing person flyers throughout the hospital and surrounding neighborhoods. "He couldn't have gone far," Dorothy insisted to the police officer who finally arrived to take a report. "He's in the middle of cancer treatment. He's weak. He has nowhere to go." But Walter had vanished completely, leaving behind only his journal, which Dorothy found tucked under his pillow. Inside, the final entry read, "Going to find Sarah. If anyone can help Frank, she can. Back soon." "Sarah," Dorothy murmured. "The sister he mentioned." Frank's condition worsened with each passing hour, his body responding to the emotional strain in the worst possible way. By evening, Dr. Harrison was discussing emergency surgical options. The timeline for Frank's planned procedure now collapsed from weeks to days. "His heart is failing faster than we anticipated," he explained to Dorothy in the hallway outside Frank's room. "The stress of Walter's disappearance has triggered a cascade effect." Dorothy nodded numbly, overwhelmed by the dual crises. "Can you save him?" "We'll try," Dr. Harrison promised. "But you should prepare yourself for the possibility that he may not be strong enough for surgery." Through the window, Dorothy could see Frank lying against white sheets, his skin nearly as pale, oxygen tubes in his nose and monitors tracking each labored heartbeat. The stubborn man who'd faced down enemy fire in Vietnam now seemed fragile, diminished by worry and illness. "Don't you dare give up, Frank Miller," she whispered against the glass. As darkness fell on the second day of Walter's disappearance, Dorothy dozed fitfully in the recliner beside Frank's bed, jerking awake at every change in the monitor's rhythm. Frank slept restlessly, medication keeping him sedated to reduce the strain on his heart. In her dreams, Dorothy saw Walter walking through snowy streets, Frank's military jacket pulled tight around his thin frame. She saw him boarding buses, consulting tattered notebooks, his determined expression at odds with his weakened state. She woke with tears on her face, uncertain what was memory and what was imagination. The hospital chaplain visited, offering prayers and comfort that Dorothy accepted gratefully, though Frank remained unresponsive. The hours stretched endlessly, nurses coming and going with quiet efficiency, doctors speaking in hushed tones about surgical options and survival rates. Dawn broke on the third day with no word of Walter, and Dr. Harrison scheduled Frank's emergency surgery for the following morning. "We can't wait any longer," he told Dorothy. "His heart function is deteriorating rapidly." Dorothy nodded, signing consent forms with a steady hand that belied her inner turmoil. "He'll survive this," she stated, a command rather than a question. "We'll do everything possible," Dr. Harrison promised. As morning sunlight flooded the hospital lobby, the automatic doors slid open to reveal an exhausted Walter Howard. His face was gaunt, his clothes rumpled from travel, but his eyes burned with triumphant determination. Beside him stood a woman in her 50s, with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a professional bun, carrying a medical bag and wearing a cardiology department badge from Massachusetts General. "I need to see Frank Miller immediately," Walter announced to the startled receptionist. "This is Dr. Sarah Howard, cardiothoracic surgeon. She's here to help him." The woman stepped forward, her credentials already in hand. "I'd like to consult on Frank Miller's case," she said, her authoritative tone brooking no argument. "I understand he's scheduled for emergency cardiac surgery tomorrow." Within minutes, word reached Dorothy, who rushed down to the lobby, her face transforming from despair to disbelief as she saw Walter standing there, exhausted, but very much alive. "Walter!" she cried, embracing him fiercely before pulling back to examine him. "What were you thinking? Where have you been? Your treatment—" "There's time for that later," Walter interrupted gently, gesturing to the woman beside him. "Dorothy, this is my sister Sarah. She's one of the top cardiothoracic surgeons on the East Coast." Dorothy turned to the woman, recognition dawning as she noted the family resemblance, the same determined set of the jaw, the same intelligent eyes. "You're Walter's sister?" she asked, extending her hand automatically. "Dr. Sarah Howard," the woman confirmed, her handshake firm and professional. "I specialize in complex cardiac procedures, particularly valve replacements in high-risk patients." She glanced at her brother, a complex emotion passing between them. "Walter tracked me down at a medical conference in New York. We haven't spoken in 15 years, but some things are more important than old disagreements." Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. "You came to help Frank?" "If I can," Sarah replied cautiously. "I'd need to review his case immediately." While hospital administrators processed Sarah's credentials and consultation request, Walter was readmitted to the oncology ward, where the staff alternated between relief at his return and stern lectures about the dangers of interrupting treatment. "You could have reversed all our progress," his oncologist scolded. "Not to mention the risks of infection while your immune system is compromised." Walter accepted the reprimand with unusual humility. "It was a calculated risk," he replied, unconsciously echoing Frank's words. "One I had to take." Upstairs, Frank awoke to find both Dorothy and Sarah Howard in his room, the latter reviewing his charts with professional intensity. "Frank, this is Walter's sister," Dorothy explained, her voice trembling with cautious hope. "She's a heart surgeon." Frank blinked slowly, medication making his thoughts fuzzy. "Walter's sister?" he repeated. "Where is Walter?" "He's back," Dorothy assured him, taking his hand. "He's downstairs getting treatment. He found Sarah for you." Frank's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "He left to find her?" Sarah stepped closer, her manner softening as she addressed her patient. "Mr. Miller, I've reviewed your case. The damage to your heart is severe, but I believe I can help." She explained a less invasive surgical approach that she had pioneered, specifically designed for patients with Agent Orange exposure, whose tissues often responded poorly to traditional procedures. "The recovery time is shorter, and the success rates are significantly higher for patients with your particular combination of issues," she concluded. Frank studied her face, seeing echoes of both Walter and James in her features. "Why would you do this for me? You don't even know me." Sarah's professional demeanor slipped slightly, revealing a glimpse of vulnerability. "My brother spent 2 days on buses and trains to find me, Mr. Miller. He showed up at my hotel at midnight, looking half dead himself, to tell me about the man who saved our father's life in Vietnam. She straightened, composure returning. And professionally speaking, your case aligns perfectly with my research focus. Later that day, Walter was wheeled into Frank's room, both men now patients again, both connected to IV lines and monitors that beeped in asynchronous rhythms. "You idiot," Frank greeted him weakly. "You could have died out there." "Look who's talking," Walter retorted, but without heat. "Had to even the score somehow." As the men exchanged gentle insults masking their deeper emotions, Sarah explained to Dorothy how she had reconciled with Walter during their journey back to Boston. 15 years of silence ended because of your husband," she marveled. "Walter told me everything, about finding Frank in the park, about the jacket, about their parallel hospitalizations. It's like something out of a novel." Dorothy smiled tiredly. Life is stranger than fiction, especially when Frank Miller is involved. The day before Frank's rescheduled surgery, now to be performed by Sarah Howard, Dorothy sat between the two hospital beds, reading aloud from Walter's journal while both men pretended not to be moved by the words. The atmosphere was one of cautious hope, Walter's latest tests showing continued response to his treatment. Frank's condition stabilized under Sarah's adjusted medication protocol. But as evening approached, bringing with it the quiet anxiety that precedes major surgery, Dr. Harrison pulled Dorothy aside for a private conversation, his expression grave as he said, "The latest tests for Walter show something we didn't expect. The chemotherapy interruption may have caused a catastrophic complication." Dorothy stood frozen in the hospital corridor, Dr. Harrison's words echoing in her mind with devastating clarity. The momentary hope that had buoyed her spirits over the past few days crumbled beneath this new reality. "What kind of complication?" she managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. "The interruption in Walter's treatment appears to have triggered an aggressive progression in some of the metastatic sites," Dr. Harrison explained gently. "Particularly in his liver. We're adjusting his protocol, but I need to be honest with you, this is serious." Dorothy closed her eyes briefly, gathering strength. "Do I tell Frank before his surgery tomorrow?" The doctor considered this carefully. In his current cardiac state, additional stress could be dangerous, but withholding information has its own consequences. "I'll be making the same mistake Frank made," Dorothy realized aloud. "Sometimes there are no perfect choices," Dr. Harrison replied. "Only the best ones we can make with the information we have." Dorothy spent the next hour pacing the small chapel in the hospital basement, weighing impossible options. When she finally returned to the room where both men rested, she made her decision. "I'll stay with Walter during Frank's surgery," she told Sarah Howard, who was reviewing final preparations for the morning procedure. "Walter needs someone, and Frank will have you." Sarah nodded, understanding the unspoken message. "I'll take care of Frank as if he were my own father," she promised. The morning of Frank's surgery arrived with soft rain tapping against the hospital windows. Nurses prepared him efficiently, explaining each step, though Frank barely heard them. His focus remained on Walter, who was scheduled for an intensive treatment to address the complications. "You'll be fine," Walter insisted, his voice weaker than it had been days before. "Sarah's the best there is. My father would be proud to know his daughter is saving your stubborn hide." Frank attempted a smile. "And you'll be here when I wake up, Howard? That's an order." "Yes, sir," Walter replied with a mock salute that couldn't quite hide the tremor in his hand. Dorothy bent to kiss Frank before they wheeled him away, her lips lingering against his forehead. "I'll be with Walter," she whispered, "but my heart is with you." "Tell him," Frank murmured, surprising her. "I know about the complications. I heard the doctors last night." His eyes, clearer than they'd been in days, held hers. "No more secrets between any of us." Dorothy nodded, tears threatening. "I love you, Frank Miller." "Love you too," he replied simply. "Always have." As they wheeled Frank toward the operating room, Dorothy turned to Walter, who watched her with knowing eyes. "He told you to tell me, didn't he?" Walter asked. Dorothy nodded, taking the chair beside his bed. "You know your situation isn't good." "I know," Walter confirmed calmly. "But Frank's going to make it. That's what matters now." "You matter too," Dorothy insisted, taking his hand. Walter smiled faintly. "I've had a good run these past few months. Found purpose again. Found family." He squeezed her fingers. "Now tell me stories about Frank to keep my mind off whatever they're about to pump into my veins." In parallel operating theaters, Frank and Walter faced their separate battles. Sarah Howard worked with precision over Frank's exposed heart, her hands steady as she implemented the specialized procedure she had pioneered. The damaged valve was worse than the scans had indicated, but she adapted with the skill of someone who had dedicated her life to saving patients others considered lost causes. "Pressure's dropping," a nurse announced, concern evident in her voice. "I've got it," Sarah responded calmly, her focus unwavering. "Give him 10 cc of epinephrine and prepare for bypass." Meanwhile, Dorothy sat beside Walter during his treatment, telling stories about her life with Frank, the funny, tender moments that defined 50 years of marriage. Walter drifted in and out of consciousness, the powerful drugs battling the cancer that had gained ground during his absence. "He tried to build me a greenhouse once," Dorothy recounted, her voice steady despite her fear. "It collapsed during the first snow. He was so embarrassed he hired a contractor to rebuild it before I got home from visiting my sister." Walter chuckled weakly. "Sounds like Frank." "He's terrible at surprises," Dorothy continued. "Always gives himself away somehow, but he tries so hard that I pretend not to notice." As the hours passed, Dorothy maintained her vigil, watching Walter's monitors while imagining Frank in surgery. The hospital chaplain visited briefly, offering quiet prayers that Dorothy accepted gratefully. "We're all connected now," she told the chaplain. 3 strangers who became something like family because of a snowstorm and an old jacket. 5 hours into Frank's surgery, complications arose. His heart rhythm became erratic during the critical phase of valve replacement. "He's fibrillating," an assistant announced. Sarah worked methodically, her training overriding emotion. "Paddles ready," she ordered. "On my count." The first attempt to restore normal rhythm failed. The second temporarily stabilized him before his heart faltered again. "Come on, Frank," Sarah murmured, memories of her father's stories about this man's determination flashing through her mind. "You didn't survive Vietnam to give up on my table." The third attempt succeeded. Frank's heart resumed its rhythm, stronger now with the repaired valve functioning properly. Sarah completed the procedure with meticulous care, closing the minimally invasive incisions with the precision that had earned her reputation. "We did it," she announced to her team, allowing herself a moment of satisfaction. "He's going to make it." 3 months later, Frank sat in the sunroom of their home, watching spring rain tap against the windows. He moved carefully, still mindful of his healing chest, but each day brought increased strength and reduced pain. The specialized procedure Sarah had performed had indeed resulted in a faster recovery than traditional surgery would have allowed. Dorothy entered with a tray of tea, setting it on the small table between Frank's chair and the wheelchair where Walter now spent most of his days. The cancer had progressed despite aggressive treatment, but Walter had defied expectations by surviving long enough to see Frank come home from the hospital. "Mail's here," Dorothy announced, handing Walter an envelope. "Another letter from your students." Walter smiled, opening it carefully with fingers that had grown increasingly unsteady. Inside was a handmade card signed by dozens of his former high school history students, each adding personal messages about the impact he'd had on their lives. "Who knew teaching would be my legacy?" Walter mused, his voice thin but his eyes bright with pleasure. Frank watched him with a mixture of joy and sorrow. Their roles had reversed in these months, Walter now the one with limited time. Frank the one with an unexpected future stretching before him. "Your journal is your legacy," Frank corrected him. "Dorothy's been typing up your stories. The publisher she contacted is interested." Walter raised an eyebrow. "Who'd want to read about two old soldiers and their 50-year debt?" "Everyone," Dorothy replied simply, pouring tea with practiced ease. "It's not just about war. It's about connection, redemption, second chances." Their new routine had developed naturally after Walter moved into their home, mornings spent together in the sunroom, afternoons with Walter resting while Frank exercised his recovering heart with short walks, evenings watching documentaries that Walter annotated with personal observations, often correcting historical inaccuracies with professional indignation. Sarah visited weekly, checking both men's progress while rebuilding her relationship with her brother. The 15-year estrangement had dissolved in the crucible of crisis, leaving a tentative but strengthening bond in its place. On the anniversary of their first meeting in the park, Frank suggested an outing. Against medical advice, but with Dorothy's reluctant support, they visited the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Boston. Frank walked slowly, leaning lightly on a cane, while Dorothy pushed Walter's wheelchair. The morning was clear, spring sunshine warming the granite surfaces where names of fallen soldiers were etched in solemn rows. Frank and Walter each wore military jackets, the original that Frank had insisted Walter keep, and a replica that Dorothy had secretly commissioned once she understood the significance of the garment. They stopped before the memorial wall, each lost in private reflection. Walter broke the silence first. "You know what my father used to say about coincidences in war?" he asked, adjusting the jacket around his shoulders. Frank nodded, a smile touching his lips. "That there are no coincidences on the battlefield, only missions we don't yet understand." Dorothy watched them with affection, taking out her phone to capture the moment. Two elderly men in matching military jackets, one standing with a cane, one in a wheelchair, both facing the memorial, with identical expressions of remembrance and respect. "Well, I think we finally understand this mission," she said softly, snapping the picture. Frank looked at Walter's jacket, then up at the clear sky above them. "Took almost 50 years, but I think you're right." Walter chuckled softly. "My father always said you were slow to catch on to things, Miller." The three made their way slowly back to the car, not as separate individuals, but as a unit forged not by blood, but by something stronger, the recognition that sometimes the most important battles are those we fight together. As they neared the memorial exit, Frank stopped suddenly, his attention caught by a young soldier in dress uniform standing before the wall. The late afternoon light cast the young man's profile in sharp relief, and for a moment, just the briefest instant, his features bore an uncanny resemblance to James Howard, as if the circle of connection and redemption was complete beyond time and space.